Okay, so I think we have most people filter in now. I'd like to welcome you guys all to CPET's seminar this year on the art of scientific presentation. CPET stands for the Caltech Project for Effective Teaching. And for people who don't usually come to CPET seminars, we have several seminars throughout the year, all on teaching topics or things that apply to teaching, like how you present scientific information that may be complex or ambiguous clearly and effectively. And so I'd encourage you to come to more seminars. We also have a certificate program that if you come to 6 seminars and write a short journal article, you'll get a certification from the dean saying that you basically took a short course on teaching and that you're particularly interested in teaching. So today we are very lucky to have Professor Tanguay here from USC. He was my undergrad advisor, and he is an amazing presenter, and so we look forward to seeing his presentation today. He is a professor of electrical engineering, chemical engineering, and material science, biomedical engineering, ophthalmology, physics and astronomy, and physics and astronomy at USC. He received his BS from here, Caltech, in physics in 1971, and his MS, MPhil, and PhD degrees in engineering and applied science from Yale in 1972, 1975, and 1977, respectively. Professor Tanguay is a fellow of both the Optical Society of America and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. As a member of an interdisciplinary research team of scientists, engineers, and physicians, he was recently awarded the Popular Mechanics Breakthrough Award for the development of intraocular retinal prostheses for the blind. He has also served as elected faculty fellow for the Center of Excellence in Teaching at USC and was a distinguished fellow in May 2005. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Tanguay.
Thank you, Noelle, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming today. I appreciate Caltech's invitation to my alma mater. I survived it, you will too. And I am delighted to have the opportunity to address you today on a topic that I think is of fundamental importance and yet is hardly discussed. I have 3 meanings of this word that gives me sleepless nights coming to a place like Caltech and using in the title of a talk. You can imagine. 3-letter words you like on your campus. There's another 3-letter institution back east you might not like so much. We happen to like 3-letter institutions, but this particular 3-letter word is not often appreciated in science and engineering. I have 3 particular interpretations I'd like to hypothesize or discuss with you this evening. The first is art thought of as craft or skill. And I'd like to convince you this evening that there are definite techniques that you can use to improve your art or skill, or craft or skill in making a scientific presentation for the fundamental purpose of what? Of connecting with your audience and teaching, if you want, the results that you have worked so hard on, usually for multiple years, to talk about in just a few minutes in the time that you're actually allotted at a professional conference or in a qualifying exam or at a PhD thesis defense or at a job talk or all of those types of environments. So that's one sense of the word. The second, obviously, is art in the sense of illustration, and I'd like to convince you through some specific examples this evening that there is quite a bit each of us can learn about how to present information in a way that is not only attractive but understandable fundamentally. That's my goal. And last but not least, if you really don't like the word at all, because this is Caltech after all, then you can realize that those are my initials and you can just think of this as my point of view. I think there's a number of reasons why you might want to be here. I listed a few of them. And I hope that it will also be clear that although I'm using the word presentation here to talk to you about how to give a version of your research orally, that almost every single thing I'm going to say this evening applies to how you write. And although we're not going to talk about writing specifically, as we go through, try to imagine how this might apply in all of the documents that you write, manuscripts for journals and the like. And if in fact that doesn't excite you to be here, then last but not least, I think people like to be cited or credited with their accomplishments. And a picture's worth 1,000 words, so if you want to know what the origin of scientific citation is, here it is. You can appreciate the gravity of the situation. Some of you, it is Caltech, know about reality and have experienced it. You can also imagine that we all understand in this day and age virtual reality, which is an artificial production of a version of reality in front of you, usually by using some head-mounted display. I'd like to talk this evening a little bit about augmented reality, in which you annotate computer animation and graphics, such as altitude, for example, or azimuth, onto a natural environment or a scene in the natural environment that you can see here. But further than that, that's useful, but further than that, we might consider systems that have enhanced augmented reality. Enhanced in the sense that you might, for example, identify a local mountain and give its elevation, find out whether there are any threats. There's another mountain, and identify this church, this approaching car. You can identify the name of the church if you use a smart camera so that you can track moving objects and also identify or use object recognition in order to be able to see a particular object. You also might want to fuse multiple sensor inputs onto the scene. Here's a situation in which people use metameric paints to camouflage, so you might see a scene that looks pretty much like it doesn't have anything there, but if in fact we were to use the right wavelengths, we could actually see it. You might fuse an infrared sensor in over here that's showing an object that's over a far hill and giving some information. The key idea here is to place these objects topographically within the scene in the direction that you're looking. So for head-up displays in aircraft, in automobiles, in boats, for the military, this is a fundamental advance in your ability to get your head out of electronic devices that make you look away with what you're trying to concentrate on and fuse this information in the scene. Now, why in heck did I start off this talk talking to you about augmented reality? Because of the fact that I wanted to use this slide in two ways. One is an illustration of the fact that that took exactly 45 seconds by the clock for me to tell you what this topic is, and I'll bet there's not a single person in this room that doesn't understand it. You don't know the technical details, you're not sure exactly how we're doing it, but at least you get the idea of what the project is about. In one slide, combining text annotations, graphics, and a way of explaining that is the second purpose for me showing you this slide that I'll get to 8 or 10 slides in. So we'll come back to this and I'll tell you what I mean. Because there's a particular method of going through this slide I think that will change the way you give your own presentations. I learned this here at Caltech, and it was drummed into my head. Scientific achievements certainly generate your scientific impact, and that was intensely described to us at every single class. But then there was this little 3-unit course called Communication Skills that you were supposed to add that would allow you to generate additional scientific impact. And of course, as you can see here, it was considered to be a small addition. And so this is the traditional view. I think the real story is that that's a mathematical lie, and the mathematical lie is in the plus sign, because it's really a multiplication. And it's self-evident if you start thinking about it that you can do all the good work that you want, but if you can't get it across to an audience, it doesn't have anywhere near the impact as if people can understand what you're doing. And that's why we're all here this evening, is to address that. And of course, you are all mathematically gifted, so you can imagine that if this is a product, it's not a good thing if that term is small. So in one slide, I'd like to tell you what ought to be, in my opinion, in every scientific presentation. And I'm going to come back and talk about this in multiple different ways. But here in just one slide is something I think that's essential for you to understand about everything that you ever present. The first statement at the top is the single most left out item in every scientific presentation I have ever been to. And that covers all the way from the very first talk I ever listened to at an Optical Society of America meeting in Rochester, New York in 1850. No, it seems like it was that long ago. I was wondering if Noel was right. Maybe that degree was in 1871. But all the way through qualifying exams and job presentations I've listened to, and invited talks at scientific meetings, and the contributed talks for sure at scientific meetings. In almost no case, after the first 5 minutes, do you have a clue what this talk is about? Now, I don't know about you, but I study audiences, and it's really interesting that after 5 minutes in an audience, when people start looking at each other, and then they start looking at their watch, and then they look at their tablet to find out what they're doing next, that's a clue to you that maybe they're not interested in your talk. Most speakers are completely oblivious of that. So one of the things I want to work with you on this evening is how we can articulate the problem that you're actually trying to solve clearly enough that people will understand all that lovely detail that you would just die to give them. Our students often start off their qualifying exams with a graph of results or something else, or start off with a diagram of their apparatus, and they go 10 or 15 minutes, and then some humble faculty member like me will put their hand up and say, well, what problem are you trying to solve? I mean, what's the deal? So I'd like to point out that you should spend a good bit of time, much more than you think. In fact, in our group, if we have a 12-minute contributed presentation at a conference, which is sort of a typical amount of time for you to do what? You don't think of it this way, but this is a data compression problem. You did 2 years of work, roughly, before this talk, and you're supposed to take 2 years of work and put it in 12 minutes. And so you're loath to tell them anything about the introduction. You want to save all that 12 minutes for all the charts and graphs and things that you spent all those hundreds of hours in the lab missing all of the football games here at campus. I'm just kidding. You missed all that good stuff in order to do all that hard work, and you don't want to leave any of it out. But I'm going to tell you that you got to spend the first 4 or 5 minutes out of the 12 minutes just stating what the problem is if you really want anybody to like the rest of your talk and remember it when they get into the hallway. Because the subtle thing I'm going to tell you about presentations is that in this day and age, they have more impact than ever before in job hiring, in promotion, in grantsmanship, in acquiring federal funds to do your work. And in almost all cases, 100 years ago, it was all done in writing. People read what you wrote. There was a lot less of it, and you could actually find it occasionally. Now I counted once when I was at Yale as a graduate student, 35,000 journals in my field, in the fields that I cover. And I decided at the time I was a graduate student at Yale that I wasn't going to ever count those again, because if I did, it would frighten the heck out of me. It already was bad enough then. So people mostly don't read what you write first. Mostly people go to a conference and hear what you say first. And then that gets them excited to come up and ask you who you are and get your card. And then they go look you up, and then they download your papers, and then they start reading them. If you do as great a job writing your papers as you do giving an oral presentation, you're going to be in great shape. But if you convince everyone in the auditorium right in the first couple of minutes that you don't know what you're talking about, or they don't know what you're talking about, or both, then in fact there's almost no chance that they're going to follow up and read anything you wrote. I guarantee you. And so we're going to spend a little time on this. Then the second important part of the content is a summary of the state of the art. Another thing that's often left out. Again, you've got 12 minutes or 20 minutes or something, and you're dying to get your results, but you forget that you have to tell people what everyone else is doing so that you can put your work in context. People like to describe what they do, but they don't think of it usually in terms of specifying the scientific approach. Is this a theoretical study? Is this an experimental study? I think a third method, a completely separate method in this day and age of doing science, is numerical simulation. I think it's proven its worth many times as something that is a different way of approaching a problem even than theory or experiment. And sometimes, of course, they nest. But I think it's important to identify that. I've listened to a lot of talks where literally at the end of the talk, I could not tell if it was a theoretical or an experimental talk, because graphs were stuck up there, but no one told me where they came from. So it's really important that people know how you approach the problem, why then this problem you think is unique, and that your approach is unique. Why is this different than what other people are doing? What did you think was unusual about this that made you think that spending a couple of years working on this was going to produce interesting results? Results, everybody likes to talk about. What most people don't like to do is to abbreviate that to key results. And I think it's important not to bury people in so many results that they can't remember the fundamental thing that you think is a breakthrough. And so it's important to summarize those results with some clarity. We'll talk about that. When you talk about conclusions, some people just end their talk on data or they end their talk stating something about the talk, but they don't stop to ask what the audience is going to actually use that talk for, or the result that they just saw for. So I think it's important to ask yourself at the end of your work, before you even sit down to write a talk, before you even start to put the pieces together, how generalizable is this work that I just did? What else does it apply to besides the one targeted thing that we focused on when we started this effort? Because that's very important to people and almost always left out. And last but not least, I enforce in my own group that our last slide is always future research directions. And there's two reasons for this. Number one, there is no problem you will ever work on that's finished when you start presenting. And you know that. And in fact, the way you know that is the night before when you can't sleep. And I hate to tell you that most of us that I've given something like 600 presentations now, total in my career. The fact of the matter is you still don't sleep much before a presentation. And that's because you're always a little bit nervous. And I finally realized that nervousness is a good thing, because what it says is this matters to me. And as soon as things don't matter to you anymore and you don't get nervous anymore, then you'd better start to worry about the value of what you're working on. But we say, okay, there are other things, those are the things during the night that you start thinking people are going to ask me, well, did you do this? Well, did you do this? Well, did you do this? And the answer is no, we haven't yet. Why not just tell people? We got this far on the problem. Here are 3 or 4 more things that we think are really important to do, some of which we're going to do, some of which we hope the rest of you in the audience will do, will work on. And the second fundamental reason for putting fundamental future research directions up is the following. If you have been to a number of conferences, and I'm sure you all have, or hear the talks that you see at Caltech, great physics research conference, 4 o'clock every Thursday afternoon at 201 East Ridge, which looks exactly the same, with the same paint in it, and the same paint peeling in the upper left-hand corner as when I was here. Just want you to know that. So that's an archival room. If in fact you go to those talks and you look around at the audience right at the end of the talk, which most of you don't do, but if you do, you'll be stunned, because there will be 5 hands going up before the speaker's done. Those are the people who really want to get at the speaker. And as the speaker goes through the next slide, they're not expecting the future research direction slide, so that comes up just as he's finishing. And he or she starts through the future research directions, and one by one the hands go down. So this will kill a lot of those questions that you'd prefer not to answer in public. Let's look at this a different way, structurally, in terms of an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. In the introduction, I think it's important to state the problem clearly. We already talked about that. But it's also important for people to know what the formulation of the problem is. In my graduate classes, I ask my students, and I welcome my EE 642 students, my advanced geometrical optics students that are here this evening from USC. I ask my students to come up with a problem themselves. And I calculate for them that they've probably solved something like 6,000 well-formulated problems in their young career, all crafted by the faculty, and all crafted in such a way that they're all about 3 lines long. They have 3 variables in them. Each one of the variables is the same symbol that's in the chapter that you're supposed to read. And those symbols are exactly the same within 3 pages of where the problem is, usual. This is in high school and beginning undergraduate school. And that's to lead you to have the notion that you can actually solve things quickly when you work on those problems. But as you know, life is not like that. And no one ever is going to walk into your office in your entire career again with a well-formulated problem. And in fact, as you get more senior, you find out that it isn't solving problems that really is important. It's coming up with the problem in the first place that's important, but nobody ever teaches you how to do it. So I just encourage you to spend a little time in every course you take thinking up a problem. What would I ask about this, and how can I articulate that so that it's clear enough that somebody else can solve it? The same thing is true when you give a presentation, because you formulated this problem somehow, but the audience doesn't know what process you went through. Now, I'm not telling you that you should stand there and tell them 100 different details about how you came up with this problem and all the dark corners and dead ends you ran into. But what I am saying is there's a particular ambiguity in the literature or in the science that you're doing that needs to be resolved. And you became aware of that ambiguity at some point, and you thought about multiple ways you could approach that problem, and you chose one that you thought would be productive. That's important for an audience to know in the beginning, because it then guides them in understanding all the other things that you're about to try to explain to them, where it took you 4 months to do it, and you have a minute and a half to say what it was. I think it's important, as I mentioned before, to talk about the state of the art, because it puts your work in context with what else is going on in the world. And you'll also find out a lot of hands will go down when you say a few things about the state of the art, because there are other people who think that they did all of this first. And the overlap integral between what you're presenting and what they actually did can be one word somewhere, and it's good enough that they think they own it. But if in fact you take a little bit of time to place your work in context of what else is going on, then I think you'll find out that you'll have a very friendly audience as opposed to an adversarial one. It's important also to let people know in the very beginning. Most people are afraid of doing this, but I think it's fundamentally important to let people know what the assumptions and limitations are that you put into the work that you're doing. You made some assumptions when you formulate, we're hoping this is small, we hope that's big, we hope the effect is observable. On the other hand, the particular theoretical approach that we're taking to this has the following limitations. It doesn't work at high temperatures, it has a problem with pressure, etc. But we want to just see if it'll actually fit. If you start with that, even the few words I just gave you, you'd be stunned again at how the audience comes around on your side of hoping that it works, instead of immediately saying, well, but they didn't take this into account, they didn't take this into account, and they feel that you're sweeping something under the rug. You don't want an audience to ever feel that about your work. In the body of the talk, you're certainly going to put in details about what you did. I just wanted to try one more time to encourage you to specify your approach, to very briefly but carefully specify the methodology that you're using, and to detail for them the principal results that come out of the study. I'm always asked at these talks about equations, so I thought I'd put a bullet in on equations. I think they typically take away from presentations unless they're fundamental. I mean, obviously, if you're adding a term to a known theory, I mean, if you decide that Maxwell's wrong and you want to add a term to Maxwell's equation, it's probably a good idea to put it up there so people see what the nature of this term is, if that's the nature of your talk. If you're a mathematician, you can ignore what I'm saying, but you're not going to use almost any of the tips that I put in this presentation anyway, so that's all right. But I think it's important to just say that equations can be pointed to. In almost no case are you going to be able to go through it and explain it to people, and I've seen people attempt that. Very good people, very bad people have attempted to explain equations to people in an oral presentation. It just mostly doesn't work. Again, unless it's a well-known theory that you're applying a small modification to. And so I would use these with great paucity and only when they're critical for people to understand you. In the conclusion, there are a number of ways that you can give a conclusion to the talk. One is to say thank you. A lot of people do that and they just stop, which usually stuns the audience. And I can tell how the coefficient of stunnage in the audience is exactly how many seconds it takes for the audience to actually sort of start clapping after somebody says thank you. Because if it's 8 or 9 seconds, then you know you completely mystified the audience. And they did not expect you were done. It's like the movie stops and the credits come up and you say, what? I think one thing to put in the conclusion, to make sure you add a conclusion at the end of the talk so that people have one more shot at understanding what it is you really think you're telling them. And that's to restate the problem in light of the results, because remember I said you were going to formulate the problem up here. Nobody knows where this is going if it's science. If it's actually a good experiment or a good theoretical approach or a good numerical simulation, you shouldn't know what the answer is. Because any information theorist will tell you the fastest way to find a solution to any known problem is to find a way of dividing life in 2 parts. You divide in half with the first experiment, you divide in half again, and that's the fastest search you can possibly have to get to an answer. You don't want an experiment that asks a question like, is the thermal coefficient of expansion of perylene at 317 degrees 1.06 times 10 to the minus 9? That's a bad idea for an experiment, because what you're actually saying is, okay, out of all trillion possibilities of this answer, I'm going to pick one and ask that question. What you really like to say is that above this number or below that number, and have a good reason why that number is important, because if it's above, then it means one thing, and if it's below, it means something else, right? So you think you formulated the problem in order to do that. And at the same time, now that you've got the results, probably the problem doesn't look the same anymore. Hopefully the problem doesn't look the same anymore. And restating the problem in light of the results is a very powerful way of concluding a talk. People will remember that. It's important that you identify the contribution, and I don't mean pointing to yourself and say, I did this, but it's important that they understand, now that you've told them the state of the art and you've told them what you're doing, what you think the meaning is of your results. What has actually been added when you're done, other than you just showed them lots of graphs and diagrams. And you want to tell them a little bit about what the implication of the results are. What does this actually mean? We talked about generalizability before. What does it mean not only within your discipline, but outside your discipline, hopefully? And then finally, the next steps that you intend to take from there to complete the study or to continue this line of investigation. Let's look at this yet another way. I think this word is completely underused when people start thinking about giving scientific presentations, and that's the word emphasis. Because in almost all cases, an outstanding scientific presentation, or any outstanding presentation, is a matter of emphasis, of carefully culling from all of the things that you know about the topic and you would just love to spew out. Those few things that would actually allow an audience that isn't always in your specialty to get the idea. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? What else has been done by other people? What did you learn? And are you excited or not when you're done? Honestly, a lot of talks I go to, you can't tell if the speaker actually almost died at the podium. It's frightening. Your first order consideration in thinking about emphasis is actually not what you think, which is getting it done before the deadline. Your first order consideration is actually the audience you're talking to. And I can tell you from great experience, I have given talks to preschoolers all the way through 6th year graduate students and also at a number of international scientific conferences. And I have used, in many cases, the same set of slides. I can use the same visual images in all of those audiences if, in fact, I choose what to emphasize. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's done this evening. You choose the topics on the basis of how important they are, and that's hard to do when you're analyzing your own work. But you got to sit down on a Saturday, and you got to look at what you've done and say, it's not just, do I want to show them I did something? The question is, can I show them that I did something that they're going to think is important? And that's important to me. Welcome. And you can ask the question in terms of figuring out what's important. You can ask, what at the absolute minimum do I want people when they walk out of the auditorium to say? Because I can tell you what the average thing is that people say when they walk out of the auditorium. Do you know what it is? What was that about? Do you have a clue what he was talking about or she was talking about? That's typical. And you don't want that to happen to you. In fact, I'll tell you another little side tip. If you go to conferences a lot, you find out that all of the cognoscenti, the people who go to conferences a lot, know what a CB is. Because most people, when they go to a conference, they look through the program ahead of time and they check all the papers they're going to go to. Oh, wow, that's important. Oh, wow, that's really good. Oh, wow, that's really good. Then you go to the conference when you're a rookie. I can tell you a long story about this if somebody asks at the end. You go to a conference and you got this whole trail of things that you're going to go do. And you go to the first day and you go to the first 8 contributed papers and then you start erasing things. And then you get bored erasing things after a while. So the next thing you do is you start writing CB next to certain people's names. That stands for coffee break. That means I never want to hear that person ever talk again in my whole life. So the next time I see that person in the list and I can't escape them, like go to a talk in another parallel room, that's a coffee break. Time to go talk to your darkened program manager or somebody else who's in the hallway. You think I'm kidding. I'm not. Because literally, after you've gone through an experience of listening for a half an hour to somebody who's saying absolutely nothing meaningful, you definitely don't want to be caught dead in that environment again. So you remember those people in your brain, as well as the people who stun you so much that you'd drive 500 miles on a Thursday afternoon when you had something else to do just to hear them talk about something that you've already heard them talk about. Those are the kind of people I'd like you to be at the end of this evening. The next thing, therefore, once we've figured out what we want to emphasize, the next thing that we want to talk about is the order of presentation. Our group, our research group at USC, has a tradition. Every conference we go to, we have one room with a king-size bed. I don't always get it because my students fight for it. So one or another of us has a room with a king-size bed. Does anybody have any clue why? Because a king-size bed is exactly the square feet that you need to take a printed version of your talk, almost all talks that you give, and to lay it out so that you can see the whole talk at once. Because none of you do that. You all have your computer and you sit and you look at one slide at a time. But all the way back to caveman days, people have loved stories. They want to hear a story, and a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. At Caltech, when I was an undergraduate, I remember many people who would walk in and give the punchline of a joke. Did you hear the one about whatever? And then, of course, it's never funny. Why? Because it was just told out of order. So we'd stand, all of us around the edge of the king-size bed, looking at the entire talk and say, okay, we're going here, and then we're going here, and then we're going, wait a minute, that's a problem because we need to introduce this. So you move that one, then we're going to talk about this, and then this, and then this, and that's problematic because this whole other subsection should really be there. So you start shuffling things around. This is maybe the evening before a talk, even when we've done this before. Because given what's going on at the conference, given other things that have been talked about, it doesn't make sense to give it in the same order you thought you were going to give it in. It's important to tell it as a story, to realize that it has a beginning that is there to get people excited about what you're doing and interested. It has a middle to tell them enough of the detail that they can appreciate that you've actually studied this in some detail, not all of the detail. It has an end in the sense that there should be some results that convince them that your approach actually works and that you'll learn something. Or that even if the results are negative, that you'll learn something from the negative results. And so certainly you'll buy, I hope that the order of presentation is extremely important. But another thing I want to convince you this evening that you may not have heard about before is the order within each slide, which I call the spatial map. And I already gave you an example of a spatial map. You just don't know I did it to you. And so let me show you what that spatial map is. I showed you this slide, and I did it for two purposes. Remember, one was to prove to you that I could tell you something about a fairly sophisticated project in about 45 seconds, but the other was to show you the spatial map. When you look at a slide, and you've seen people do this in conference after conference, you'll see a speaker go to the next slide and then they look up. Oh yeah, let's see. Well, this wasn't supposed to be here. But let me, well, okay, I can, no. And you wonder, did you put this talk together or somebody else? Right? You don't know that's the next slide? I'll come back to that point about how you hook slides together. But for right now, I want to show you what my spatial map is for this slide. I don't get surprised by my slides because I study carefully where I enter this slide, where I go on this slide as I'm talking about it, and where I leave this slide. Because everybody's nervous when they talk. And trust me, it's a lot easier if you turn around and you look at something you're very familiar with and you've worked out how you're going to talk about it. Not in detail. I don't believe in memorizing stuff at all. But I do believe in knowing an order through each slide that actually makes sense. And it isn't just makes sense to you. It has to make sense to me because I'm the stooge that's up here having to say it, right? And you're the one, when you're up front, that's nervous enough that it's easy to forget and to just be stunned by your own material. So in this particular slide, I started with reality because it's something I know will connect to all of you. I didn't start reading the title to you, but I started over here. And I always remember there's a little slot right here for virtual reality because I want to differentiate what I'm talking about here from virtual reality. Then I pointed to augmented reality, which is a clue to me to talk about what that is with this text bullet, and then to give you two examples, azimuth and altitude. And then to talk about another thing that you might like to do, which is to enhance that by pointing out other features in the environment. here, and here that actually require something more sophisticated than you have in a usual augmented reality system. And then I go to here because that immediately clues yet other things I might want to add in a presentation of something that you're looking at in the environment, which is these two sensors that are being fused. Specifically, both examples I described, and then come back and mention that the key idea here is that I place them where you're looking. They're in the direction where they're supposed to be in the image. So I can go through this slide at any time t that you place it in any one of my talks, because I remember where to start and where to go, and it's just a particular sequence to go through it. I don't have to do that when I'm presenting it. Trust me, I can present this slide 5 different ways. But if I remember the spatial map within this slide, I don't get myself lost when I've got 13 minutes or 12 minutes in a conference presentation, and you really are restricted in time, and you have to get through it in an order that will actually make sense to both you and the audience. This gets to the issue of how you prepare slides or visual aids. In our research group, we start every talk. If we're going to go to a conference, we don't write an abstract, we don't submit stuff. We sit down and ask, what are the visual graphics that we would give in this presentation? What are the figures? Do we have a diagram of the system? Do we have a diagram of the method? Do we have a few graphs of the results? Can we take a look at what this is going to look like first? Because if you lay out the graphics that you're going to use first, you'll find out putting the talk together is actually very straightforward. And by the way, it equally applies to writing a manuscript. When you sit down to write a paper, if you start with the figures that are going to be in the paper, you'd be stunned how easy it is to write the text. Almost nobody does that. Almost everybody sits down and tries to write the introduction and just continues to write through the paper. And then they start adding figures as they go. This will take you 4x time, and it will be 1 over 4x as good when you're done, I believe. So it's important when you prepare these to start with the graphics, I think, and to realize that you're actually preparing these not for the audience. And it seems completely counterintuitive. You're actually preparing them for you first. These should cue you to the things that you need to tell the audience. And in particular, when you practice a talk ahead of time, and I'm sure all of you do, you'll find out that when you give a talk, you typically glitch on something. You'll say, oh, I can't remember the temperature at which this was done, or something. Why don't you put it on the slide? You got all that space there. If there's something that you need to remember and it's important to the talk, then put it somewhere on the slide you put together as a clue to you to remember to say it. Or even as something that you want the audience to just viscerally pick up, and you think it's important, they know it's done at room temperature, you don't need to particularly say it, but saying T equals 295 Kelvin up there is a really nice thing to do. It's important to pay attention to font size and clarity, and there's a couple of rules for doing this you've probably heard before. One certainly is to sit in the back of a room and take a look and see if you can actually read the things that you're asking the audience to read. That's one way to do it. The other way, since you all have beautiful laptops and desktops now, is to ask the following. If you can sit at your desk and you can read it on your display, then you probably can read it in an auditorium, because the aspect ratio is just about the same. The angular size of the screen relative to you up here is very similar to what the angular size is to you. Well, of course, you all have the 40-inch, forget it if you have a 40-inch iMac, I'm not talking about that. But something that's 10 by 12 inches or so in size, where you're 16 or 18 inches away, is a reasonable angle for you to be able to ask the question if something is big enough there. And I've been to many conferences where literally if you walked up to the screen, you couldn't read the font that's on there. Well, and I should also mention, I'll come back to this later, there's a great set of books. The very first one in the series is called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. It's by Edward Tufte. He has written a whole series of books, 6, plus his wife wrote one recently, that are well worth taking a peek at in the library if you haven't seen them before. And I'll give you some examples of these as we get toward the end. This is a title slide. I want to go through a number of examples now of how slides are put together and how you might think about talking through them. This slide is misused by nearly every person I've ever seen give a talk. I don't know if you notice this, but you go to a conference and there's usually a session chairman. The session chairman there has a program. Not only that, everyone in the audience has a program. Everyone in the audience is saying, oh, this is a talk on intraocular retinal prostheses by this guy from USC. session chairman is, of course, reading that, and he'll either read it from the slide or from the program. The poor rookie who's giving this talk is being wired by somebody, an assistant, or he's trying to fumble with the thing himself and isn't paying any attention at all to what's going on. So this is what typically happens. The next talk is an intraocular retinal prostheses and optics of the human eye by Armand, who's at the University of Southern California, and his collaborators are Iwanowitz and Yamamurti and whoever else. And then it says, okay, and the speaker stands up, and the speaker says, hi, my name is Armand, and I'm here to talk about an intraocular retinal. It goes right through the title slide. You know why? Because they practiced the title slide 86 times at home. And they're not dynamic enough to figure out what's going on. So I want to give you a rule. Never talk about this slide. This slide is up there for two purposes only. It's up there so that you know that your talk, it's your talk you're giving. Because believe me, I've seen that happen a few times. That's frightening. I know one guy who's so good at giving talks. Somebody loaded a different talk, the AV guy, and he looked at it and thought it was interesting, so he just started talking. Those of us that knew him were on the floor. I mean, it was tremendous. You know? But the guy who was supposed to give the talk was all in panic and waiting. This slide is so you know this is your talk, and so the audience knows this is the talk they think they're in. Because you'll also see people do the head bob. They're doing this. They're looking between where they think they are and what they think this talk is, and they go, "Oh my God, I actually am supposed to be in the Sheraton Hotel instead of the Hilton, and it's 4:30 and not 4:15, and I'm completely screwed up." And then, so as soon as the title slide goes up, don't panic, because you'll see 8 or 10 people just get up and leave. They don't hate you, unless you're a CB for them. I'll tell you the Armand metric for a powerful speaker, for a good and dynamic speaker. This is Caltech, so I made it a mathematical theorem for you. Okay? It's the number, you numerically add the number of people that enter the room when your talk is being announced to the number of people that leave the room exactly when you're done. I have seen speakers in my career that are plus 4,000 on that scale. They can fill an auditorium that seats 2,000 people. People will pour in from everywhere. You had a person on this campus who could do it, Richard Feynman. It's not fair if it's Beckman Auditorium and it's the only talk of the day. I'm talking about at a conference where people have a choice. But you can see a speaker that will fill an entire auditorium, and when he's done, there's going to be nobody following that, right? So it's time to go get some coffee or something else, and the audience clears. This is a signed quantity, ladies and gentlemen. So if your talk is announced and the auditorium clears, that's a minus number of people. And if they're waiting at the door, and you see the door kind of going a little crack, and people are holding coffee out there and donuts and just waiting until you're done. And as soon as they say, okay, in the next talk, and then the doors open and a flood comes in, that's a minus number 2. And I've seen people that are minus 4,000 in my career. That's scary. Somebody that just can completely clear an auditorium, and then it will fill back in tentatively, just to make sure that person's not still talking. That's the purpose of the title slide. This is an example of a slide that has some important information on it, and I'm showing it to you as an example of a couple of things. One, it's important to put a title on a slide that actually means something about that particular slide. And you'll see people forget, and they won't change their title almost halfway through their talk. And there's slide after slide after slide that actually are about something else. It's important to be simple, if you can, about what it is you're trying to describe, so that mostly the people in the audience, during the time you talk about this slide, can pick up what it's about. I have illustrations over here of 2 major diseases. I don't ever talk about these. Once or twice if somebody asks a question, but they're there just for the people in the audience that are experts in that area. I usually have ophthalmologists in an audience, for example, and they know these conditions and they can recognize these, so add something to them. It's not there for everybody. This is a fundamental property of putting together a good talk, is to make sure that there's a range of information on every slide, not all of which you feel obligated to talk about. Some things you put there to remind you. Some things you put there in case of a question. Some things you put there just because they look a lot more interesting than if I left those off and I just showed you the things on the right-hand slide. Last but not least about this particular slide is it's a clue to remind me to tell you about the hook or that transition between slides. Remember, we laid them out on the bed, we looked at the order. But one of the things that we do very carefully is to say always about every slide, what is the last thing I'm going to talk about on this slide? What's the very last thing I'm going to say on this slide? Because that should lead into exactly the first thing I say on the next slide. So that as you're changing slides, you don't have that, oh yeah, now we're changing topic sort of reaction. It's a story, remember? So the last point I make on this slide, no matter how I go through these points, is to talk about these two particular diseases primarily affect the photoreceptor layer. These are diseases that cause blindness, as you've picked up. And the place that I start on this slide is to talk about the photoreceptor layer in a multi-layered retina, which is an add-on to a figure. This figure, you can see, is labeled in a particular way. It's extracted from the source. This is actually extracted from the same source, but reduced a lot, so that it actually looks like a blow-up of this little particular region, which is the point. You can see that the labeling in here is way too small for people in the audience to read, but I don't care because I'm going to explain all that to them. And so in this particular case, it's okay that not everything's labeled, and if I labeled that so that everybody could read it, it would actually be distracting. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of license in your ability to put things together, because the key point here is that it's a photoreceptor disease. The photoreceptors are back here, and shockingly, these cells that are sitting right up near the inner surface of the retina are alive and functional 30 years after blindness, 30 years after all of these cells turn to mush. There is no physical structure there at all. So these cells have been sitting there for 30 years with no excitation at all, and somehow they're still viable. This was discovered by Mark Humayan at USC just by asking the question. He's an ophthalmologist. He looked in eyes of people with these diseases, and he said, gee, the inner layer looks fine. I don't see any problem with the inner layer. Maybe those cells are viable. Everybody said, you're crazy. He stuck a needle in a volunteer's eye. The sclera is not filled with nerves, so it's okay. And he excited one of these cells with a little voltage that caused an action potential. The patient said, I see a spot of light for the first time in 30 years. And we very quickly said, okay, if we can stimulate in one place with a spot of light, then we can put an electrode array here, and maybe we can stimulate those inner neurons, these retinal ganglion cells, as if they were being driven optically by the photoreceptor layer if I just provide them with a camera input. And that's part of this whole project that we've been working on. The only point I want to make about that transition is I can hook from the previous slide to this one and tell you the story as long as I remember where's the last place I have to leave that one and where's the first place I enter here, so that you don't lose the continuity of the story as we go from one to the other. And of course that leads to this diagram down here at different places that you could actually stimulate an eye or a brain in order to provide prosthetic vision. And so you can talk about this slide in many ways, but often I've just gone through this slide and left here without ever having to talk about the things that are on the right-hand side. In some audiences, it's important because I want to differentiate it from other approaches to solving blindness. And to focus on the particular approaches, here's a nice use of color to just illustrate out of a whole bunch of possible choices of places you could put a prosthesis, and out of a number of different possibilities for the way that you could stimulate cells, those are the two that we are working on. Not all possible things you could do, but those are the two that we happen to choose. And you can imagine that that leads to the next slide then. And we give a diagram of a retinal prosthesis with electrical connections. And that's often a slide like this. I put this in here because it's got a number of interesting features. Number one, we've spent, one of my young colleagues, Ben McIntosh, is a spectacular artist digitally, as well as a great young scientist, and his illustrations are marvelous. So it's very easy to describe this approach where you put the camera on glasses, but you have all the problems of having to look exactly in a particular direction in order to have the camera see what it is you're looking at, but you have the discontinuity that if I look at you and then with my head, but then I look at you with my eyes, then what my head is seeing is what looks over there, so you find out that things swim. And early people working on this didn't recognize this problem, and we did because of my background in pilot training, actually, because one of the things you learn when you first learn to fly is don't move your head, don't move your head, don't move your head, because if you foveate, if you use natural eye motion, you get much less dizzy and nauseated than if in fact you're in a three-dimensional moving environment and you move your head a lot. Well, the same thing's true for blind people. And so our project has been to move that camera inside the eye, which has been technologically very difficult, but very exciting. So now we have a camera that we're building that's about 3 millimeters by 4.5 millimeters long, that can be implanted in the crystalline lens sac, and it will allow this to be a fully intraocular retinal prosthesis. The only reason I point this out is that here on one slide, I can compare and contrast two different approaches to solving a problem. Most people put these on separate slides, but then it's really hard to appreciate what the differences are. So sometimes juxtaposing two approaches, even though they're a little smaller than you might like, oftentimes if we want to go into something in detail, we'll put another slide in where we can take one diagram and blow it up the full size of the slide. But sometimes it's important in justifying the purpose of what you're doing to use this side-by-side comparison. I'll give you another excellent example of that in just a minute. This, as you can imagine, is an outline. This, as you can imagine, is not an outline like most outlines you see people give at the beginning of their talks, because they always put in things like title slide, outline. I've seen outline listed as part of their talk in the outline, and a whole bunch of other useless stuff that you don't want to hear about in an outline. That's all I want to hear about. If you're going to give me an outline of what you're going to talk about, is what's the problem you're going to talk about, what are the first 3 things you're going to say, what's the key point you want to make, then you're going to tell me a couple of other things that lead up to something else. Great, I'm done with the outline. I get it, let's go. Right? I need 15 seconds to go through an outline like that. Maybe 30 seconds. Instead of 2 minutes to try to explain, like, you've heard this before. I'm going to show you the title slide, and you've seen that already. And then I'm going to go through the outline, and we're doing that right now. And then they'll have the outline come through 17 times in the talk, each time with a color that moves down to tell you where you are in the outline. And this is a 12-minute talk. I mean, I can remember what you're talking about for 12 minutes. Give me, as the audience, some credit, right? You feel that. Don't waste your time with outlines. You're going to put an outline in a talk. Make sure it has a purpose. And when I write an outline like this, the purpose is I want you to, at one time in the talk, integrate the concepts I'm now going to differentially explain to you one at a time, because I can't do them all at once. That's the purpose of an outline. This is an example of a slide in which, when I talk about it, I have a key point in which it's difficult to say what you mean about one principal type of eye, a single-centered lens, without showing an example. So I show an example, and once again I put this in because the annotations here need not be large enough for you to read them, because that isn't the purpose of why that's on this slide in this particular case. And I know you've probably been taught that everything should be readable, but that's not true, because a lot of things that are on there are distracting. If I could have, I would have just taken off all the annotations. That's really difficult when you're lifting figures from here, there, or wherever, and you don't have infinite time to put together a talk. So when you do this, always make sure that you say where you got things from. That's important. It doesn't have to be bold. It doesn't have to be a complete reference. It just has to be enough that people know that you took it from somewhere, mostly, and that they can come back and ask you afterwards if, in fact, they want to find out what that particular reference is.
You put it in yellow and you don't want them to read it?
No, it depends. On here it's very clear. It depends on the projector and whether or not that actually shows up. You can put it in colors. I mean, I think you could see the one before just fine. The one that's on the left-hand side here. Your artistic choice. And since you have a vest with yellow fluorescent stripes on it, I can see why you would bring up that point. This is an example of annotation. Here's an annotation where I told you it didn't matter. Here's an annotation where I think it really does matter. This is a figure from Feynman's lectures on physics. Feynman has a diagram in which it's essentially hand-labeled. There's nothing wrong with that. I went ahead and hand-labeled the two curves. He didn't hand-label, just so that it was clear which one was which. Because when people look at these, you can talk to them all day long about, and you've seen speakers do this. Imagine the annotations aren't there. Well, you can see on the photopic curve the blah, 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 and the scotopic curve, and the difference between the photopic and the scotopic, and they're going back and forth, and neither is labeled, and you don't know which one's which. In which case, all the stuff they just told you is completely useless. So it's really nice to just, muck up your diagram a little bit and let people know what's what. I wanted to make absolutely sure, so I called out here which particular curve this is and gave you a little bit more detail about it. And whether or not I want to talk about that or not is not important, but those that are experts in the audience will know exactly what this is. He talked about relative visibility, but these curves really have a particular technical name. This is Dick Feynman, so of course he plotted this as a physicist. It's energy going to the right. Most people in optics plot it wavelength going to the right. He actually labeled it wavelength, which is fine, because that's the way optics people would label it. You've got to look carefully to see that it's actually going in the other direction. And that gives rise to a particular phenomenon. I don't know if you know this or not, but your eye actually has a peak sensitivity in daylight that's quite different than it is at nighttime. And there's a really interesting physical and biological reason why this is true. Anyway, I note also, it says note linear scale here because almost all of these curves that are ever plotted are plotted on a logarithmic scale because there's many orders of dynamic range. And if you're an expert, you look at these curves instantly and you say those can't be right. So this is just a call out to the expert in the audience to say, I plotted it here on a linear scale and that's why it looks more Gaussian and a lot less like the sort of vertical fall off that you'd see on a logarithmic plot. So these annotations also help the speaker because you can't get lost. You can't forget which curve is which. You won't get confused about which way the wavelength goes. You won't get confused about what the scale is because you've taken just a few minutes to annotate those on your slides before you went to give the presentation. This is a lovely illustration of a clever use of spatial position in a slide to make a point. These are 8 different pupil diameters, and what we're plotting is the relative responsivity of the retina of your eye to a point target. So imagine I take one really small spot of light and you look at it with your eye, and I ask in angular space, in visual angle, which I thought it was a little too small here, so I brought it out to the side to make sure people can see it. In angular space, as I increase the pupil diameter, what's the visual acuity that you have for that small spot? Does it start to look broad and fuzzy, or does it stay really sharp? And the key point about the spatial orientation of this slide is there are 8 different pupil diameters shown, and you notice they walk up to the top and walk back down to the right. And the reason is that what Brian Wandel, a very famous vision scientist and who's written an excellent book from which this figure comes, his point was to compare this one and this one. When all is said and done, what you really care is what does it look like when your pupil is as narrow as possible, and what does it look like when your pupil is as dilated as possible. And all the other cases are in here so you can look at how it goes, but that isn't really the point. So this is the fundamental result, and this is the verb, if you want. This is how you get from here to there. But that allows him, in giving this talk, to talk about it this way, to show how things increase, and the solid line here is that the size, if you want, in angular space of that spot on your eye as the pupil dilates, and the dashed curve, by comparison, is as the pupil dilates, the best you could possibly ever image that spot gets smaller and smaller because the diffraction limit gets smaller. So you can see over here that your eye is not diffraction limited, but you actually are diffraction limited in room illumination or in bright outside illumination. So it allows him to make that point elegantly by the placement of these 2 figures. Most people would not do this. They just start putting them on the view graph that way, or try to cram them all in horizontally or something, and then you find out, you catch yourself when you're presenting it, looking at the very last one and looking at the very first one, and trying to make that comparison where people have to move their heads. It's like a tennis match, you know, trying to see what this thing is. This is an example in which a photograph can tell a story much more effectively than almost any words that you can write. And I put some words over here just to keep people oriented. But this is a photograph in my Caltech office. I was here on sabbatical in 2000. And this is from Moore Lab, looking north toward the San Gabriel Mountains. It was on a crystal clear blue day in which the atmosphere back here, the sky was brilliant blue. The mountains were incredible. This looks totally smoggy. It's not. It's a photographic artifice. I shot this in my office with 10 additional lights. I brought in 10 extra lamps and shot it with a digital camera, good digital camera. And you can see it's all overexposed in here. You see no detail here in the tree. These are all overexposed. The sky's all overexposed. The color balance is shifted inside and out. You can see almost nothing in the office. And it was so bright in the office that it was almost hurtful to the eyes. And yet when I looked at that, I saw the same thing that you do every single day of your life. When you're inside a room and looking out, you see everything in the room just fine, and you see everything outside just fine. And one of the things that bugged the heck out of me a number of years ago is, at what point, as I come to the edge of the window, does it start to go bad? Namely, if your eye is compensating in the middle over here, and your eye is compensating over here somehow because your eye is adaptive, great, but there must be a transition range over which it's not so good. And so we studied this, by the way, and we found out that your eye adapts to within 1 arc minute. That's the fundamental visual acuity of your eye. This particular phenomenon works. And it had been said for almost 100 years in the literature that this was done high up in visual cortex, and we ended up showing in this study it's actually done in the retina because of the particular acuity and a couple of other tests. But in this one graph or this one figure, you get the whole idea of the fact that it's problematic to do this with most artificial sensors, but you know yourself that you can do this very easily. And I can prove it to you with a simple experiment. Again, a nice thing to do with an audience. At some point in time, if something's important to you in your talk, do the experiment. So here I have 4 gray squares, and they're placed on a color tablet. So this is as dark as possible. The scale is over on the right-hand side. And this is the darkest row, and then they get brighter and brighter row by row, or column by column, I should say, if we go to the right-hand side. And so I can just ask the audience, if you look at this particular square here, what color does it look the most like, or what brightness does it look the most like as I go across? This one? This one? This one? Wow, no hands. It's Caltech for sure. Okay, grunts. The Caltech grunt told me. Okay, so I look at this one, and we start going. Do you think it looks like this? Like this? Like this? Like this? I promised you that I would show you that a Caltech audience is educated. There's my proof. They self-adapted. Okay, the fact of the matter is, you probably guessed, all 4 of these squares are identical in brightness, and they're exactly that brightness. And in fact, I always carry with me to talks a little piece of paper that has this on it so that we can play origami and fold it up. And once you get this center set of squares next to that one and you blocked off the surround, then it works perfectly. And it, like your eye, is just adapting to what's around it. It's a non-local phenomenon. You can show it very easily that your eye lies. You can do this in color. That's frightening. I typically don't show an audience at this time of the evening because most people, oh, this is Caltech. Most people are fashion sensitive, and you end up showing them that their sense of color is completely screwed up depending on what's around it. So you go to the store and you put something on and it looks great, and you walk home and you put it with the rest of what you wanted to wear, and you find out it looks atrocious. It turns out it's because your eye lies, because your eye is trying very hard to optimize contrast and differentiability of color, and it has a lot of mechanisms for doing that, and is very good at it, and it will mostly keep you alive in the desert when you're trying to see a snake in the bright light and maybe a mountain lion on a rock in bright sunshine at the same time. The snake may be in the shadow. And your eye is really good at doing that, and this proves to you that it happens, that you actually do it yourself. Okay, it's just an example of doing an experiment with an audience in order to be able to get one central point across that you find is fundamental to whatever else you then want to talk about. This is an example of a visual image of one of the first intraocular camera prototypes we made. This just shows the sensor we started with, the camera we started with. We took out the lens, and you can see the image sensor array, and we put in our own lens, and we took our very first image, and although it looks horrible to you, it was spectacular to us because it's much better than you can possibly support in giving a prosthetic vision device to the blind. So this showed us that even a trivial implementation of the simplest idea that we had for doing this was actually going to be plenty good enough. And that's very powerful. This is an example of how a little bit of a movie or a dynamic element can make a point much better than you can describe it. We found out to our great shock, Noel was involved in this discovery, that the depth of field of these tiny cameras we were making was much better than we thought, so that blind people could actually bring things up much closer to their eye. And of course, things get larger as you bring them closer to your eyes, so you don't need as much resolution, which is a good thing because that's hard for us. So we discovered this accidentally, and then we modeled it, and it works perfectly, but then we made a movie in which we just took a box with USB written on it and stuck it right up to the camera about 1 centimeter away, and then that's just me walking backwards in the room away. And And you can see the resolution on the far wall is about as good as it was up close. And in fact, when you study this, you find out the resolution really is almost independent of distance, all the way down to a centimeter, whereas you typically can't see inside about 12 inches or so. This is an example where we took one of our first prototypes driving. We mounted it in my car, and at one point in time, actually at night, we went driving, and I did it from the laptop, just looking at this display. But this shows the problems that you have with typical camera sensors that you'd like to put in the eye. You get into a tunnel, you can't see anything, you come out, everything blooms. But we did this just to find out how a camera like this, with a field of view that we think we could support in a prosthesis, would actually look to somebody who was blind if we could supply that resolution. Again, I can tell you, I don't have to talk about that. You get it while you're watching it. And you know, I'm sure from good talks that you've seen, that the important use of these kinds of visual aids can make a point that's very hard for you to describe any other way. This is a slide that's actually a top-bottom slide. Top-bottom in the sense that up here I have a story I can tell of a prosthesis that we actually have, a prosthetic implementation, a prototype that we built. I have all the components laid out here. I can talk about those. I can just start with the main component and show you how we put it into something we actually implanted in the eye of a canine and what the image actually looked like. I can tell the story by actually talking about the details of the components that we actually used. So I can use this multiple ways depending on the audience. But importantly, all the information's there. So if somebody asks about it, I don't have to remember. Well, I don't remember, it's a GPCX261V. Who remembers that? But somebody in the audience will care because they're from Panasonic or something and they recognize their camera, right? So it's useful to add information that you don't always talk about precisely because of the fact that you may at some point have to. This is an example of I'm sorry to talk to the biologists this way, but forgive me. Biologists love to do this to you. Annotation is a word that has not been invented in biology, according to me, having sat through thousands of these talks. Scales, axes, and other such things have not been invented in biology yet. I don't know why that is. But I have listened to, I don't know how many talks. If you're lucky, they'll actually have a title up here that relates to what they're doing, but it'll always have something like that. And you don't know if that's a chemical, that's the sample number, that's the test protocol, that's the IRB number, that's the university number on some federal registry. You don't know what it is. And the person will stand there, and they don't use a pointer either. So they'll stand there and say, as you can see, the GFP elucidates the interneuron connections, but not the intraneuron connections. And at the same time, the AFP stain does not show the effect that we anticipated. And you're just standing there, and you have no idea what they're talking about. There's stuff up there, and they know what it is, and you don't. But the words are coming out. This is a classic example in an area I'm well familiar with, and people do the exact same thing. As you can see, there is essentially no hypoxia or ischemia in the optic disc, but as you look in the macular region, you can see that there's significantly more temporal ischemia than there is nasally. Terrific. Why don't you just put a couple arrows on there and maybe an identification of where the macula is, or move it over a little bit and put a couple bullets here to say what it is that you want to say, so the poor people in the audience, especially in this day and age, ladies and gentlemen, you have not experienced life until you've taught a class in the last 2 or 3 years, and you sit in the front of the room and you see every time people are doing this. And so there's this new mode of listen, text. I don't know if they're texting things about what they're listening, probably not. Or if they're trying to maintain 2 lives at the same time, 2 different parallel universes at the same time. But think of the poor person in your audience who happens to dip their head right when you point to something. And then they look back up and they have no idea what's going on because you didn't take the time to label it. So it doesn't work anymore. It's worthwhile to take a little bit of time putting these things together. This is just a quick tour through these books by Tufte. I highly recommend that you take a look at it if you care to be a great speaker someday. His first book is actually about how to graph, chart, and table things. He refers to this almost as nouns. These are the things, the data that you actually want to present that are one-dimensional, monodimensional, typically, but yet can be plotted in very unusual ways that really tell much more of the story than the traditional, it has 2 axes and there's a graph. Second book that he wrote extends that idea to multidimensional information. I'll give you just one example here. Here's a tour of, I think it's one of Napoleon's trips on one of his campaigns. And instead of just drawing out this on a map or listing the cities they went through or something, he actually drew a topographic map and showed where the Army actually went, making exploratory forays here, there, and everywhere. And it's much more graphic to be able to look at that and to understand it than it is to plot it in almost all the traditional ways. So this is interesting ideas on how to deal with multidimensional information. And then he wrote a third book called Visual Explanations that he calls Verbs. This is how do you illustrate cause and effect? How do you illustrate in a clear and convincing way something that's dynamic, something that's evolving temporally? And it's actually not trivial to do. And in fact, here's a whole bunch of artist conceptions. There's one set of pages. I know it's too small for you to look at, but there's a whole bunch of artist conceptions about how to show a moving glass, how to show just a goblet that's shaking. And it's quite interesting to look through these and find out which are effective and which are completely worthless. So I want to just close by giving you a few tips, a few ending tips about how to give a talk, not just how to put it together, which is mostly what we've been talking about. I think there are 3 C's involved. No one at Caltech likes to get C's, no one at USC either, but these are the 3 key C's involved in the topic of articulation, how you say what it is you want to say. And that's context, clarity, and conciseness. Context, we already talked about in the sense that if you get the order right, you've mostly placed everything that you're now talking about in the context of things that come before and after it. Clarity is important. It means of all the possible ways that you could say this particular thing, that in your lab group you always say it this way, how do you need to say that to an audience that isn't your lab group? Namely, what words would I use to articulate this concept so I could tell it to somebody in high school, or I could tell it to somebody in an elevator in 2 minutes, or something else. And you'll find out that there are many choices about the way you can say things, and it's useful to think about that approach before you give a talk. And last but not least, in almost all cases, you're going to be short of time. And so it's important to think about how you're going to go through a complicated topic in such a way that it doesn't take a lot of time, and yet at the same time it's clear. And in our group, what we do is we put the speaker in front of the room, even if it's me, and we time every slide. So we have somebody sitting there who's not listening to the talk at all, just writes down the time in seconds, exactly when you started and stopped every slide. There is no speaker I have ever met who has done this with me, who has not been stunned to find out that 2 of those slides out of 17 slides you had took 6 minutes each. They're stunned. They said, that's not possible. That's all I said was this and this and this and this. Yeah, but you got stuck there, and then you tried to say it a different way. And what we say, why do we do that? Because the 2 6-minute slides means you don't have a clue yourself what you're talking about there. You need to rethink how you're presenting that particular slide or material in such a way that you can do it in a minute or a minute and a half. And in the beginning, you say, that's impossible. There's so much stuff here. Great, break it into 2 slides if it's too complicated. Most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, it just means you use the 3 C's and you think, did I anticipate it well enough, or am I trying to explain here something that isn't here? I'm trying to do in vapor something I should have told you explicitly, or with a figure, or with a photograph, or something else. Is there a way that I can use better clarity in the words that I'm using to make it clear, and is there a way I can make it more concise? And typically, the second pass through a talk like that will find that there is no slide that takes more than 2 minutes, usually the same 2. And then the third time you go through it, now everything's down, it runs at a reasonable pace, and you can actually finish on time. So I highly recommend when you think about actually speaking or articulating what it is you have in mind to present to people, that you try this kind of an approach. Preparation is important when you go to a conference or when you go to give a talk anywhere. Those of us that are in this business, that have been doing science and engineering for a while, know that you don't show up at a conference to give a talk not having seen the room. I refuse to give a talk anywhere in which I can't see the room ahead of time. I always schedule, if I'm going to visit a university, I always ask them, can we go see the room in the morning if I'm talking in the afternoon? And you think, that's crazy, why do you need to do that? Because when you get there, you find out what's happening this evening. The podium that's usually here is now gone, and this is here. The cable that's usually here isn't here, it's a different one. Cables are placed, in this case, by me, so I know where they are exactly, and you notice I didn't trip over them. But There are people called AV technicians, audiovisual technicians, who have not much to do at a conference when you're talking, and they certainly don't want to listen to what you're talking about. So their entire enjoyment in life is to get a donut, which is free, and a coffee, which is free, and sit in the back of the room and watch you trip over the cables that they have cleverly left with a little loop where they taped it down on both sides to make sure no one else tripped there, but they left the loop right where you have to put your foot in order to get from here to the screen so that they can then laugh, and then that's cool, and then next time they move it for somebody else. So it's important to go, and I'm serious, so you go into the room ahead of time, and we undo all the things they do. I don't know if you know this or not, but people have preferences about which way they use a laser pointer. This is going to sound really silly to you until you come up here and try it yourself. But I have to tell you that for me, I'm right-handed. If I give a presentation and I'm on this side of the room, which is where they place most podiums in most scientific conferences, and I don't know why, it means you have to do this. So number one, you have to stick your arm in front of the screen. And number two, you find out that if you're nervous, people can measure your heartbeat. And you know, you see people that actually do these kind of circles like this because they can't possibly hang on to the bloody thing. I don't know what it is. But if you think about it for 2 seconds, you realize that if you're right-handed and I come over here and I'm just as nervous and I still have a heartbeat, I can put this across my body and I brace it, and now I can put it right inside a circle O because now it's braced. Over here it's not. It's very simple. It makes an enormous difference. Our group moves podiums. We go in the night before, and all that careful stuff the AV guys did, we say, nah, I'm not going to do that. So we move it over. And then they come in the next day, I swore and I put it over. They're not going to move it. And so the whole conference now gives the presentation from this side so that when you present, perfect, no problem. Well, look, it's 50-50, right? It's important to know how big the room is. This is a very horizontal room. I chose this room here. I love this room. I've given this talk here actually 4 times. Over the last 10 or 12 years, and I've enjoyed it every time. It's a beautiful room to give a presentation in because you don't need a microphone and you can reach everybody in the whole room. And I'll tell you how to do that in the next one. That's the last point on here. But if you don't know what the room is like, you don't know how to project, and you don't have any feeling ahead of time of where you need to be looking and where you need to be standing in order to connect with the whole audience. So you go look at the room ahead of time. It's skinny and long and narrow. I gave one at Polaroid Corporation once that was exactly 5 chairs wide and 80 chairs long. Weird room. This one's horizontal. It makes a huge difference to your comfort just to know what it's like and to feel what's like. So stand up front in a break at a conference and get a feel for what it's like. Try projecting your voice ahead of time. So you don't do what a lot of speakers where they have the microphone and then they'll look out at the audience and then they say their very first thing and everybody jumps because it's 14 times too loud. Or you find out that no one can hear you anyway because the microphone is sucking all the acoustics or something. I don't know what it is, but some people talk and you can't hear anything, right? They have the reverse Bose headset microphone. Find out what the acoustics are like, find out where the lights are. There will be people there that are supposed to turn on and off the lights. They won't have a clue. So find it out yourself ahead of time so you can set up the lighting so it works for what you're trying to show. There's nothing worse than putting all this time and effort into beautiful view graphs and standing up, and you'll find in a lot of auditoriums they actually have one light setting that has a spotlight on the screen. Do you know why that is? It's because the screen isn't always there. There's stuff behind it, like these boards that the spotlight's supposed to illuminate, but the blark left it on for you, right? So now you're trying to show your entire talk, and you have a spotlight in the middle of your slide. No one can see anything. And some people will just stand up and they're completely oblivious. They'll just give the whole talk that way. And everybody can't see anything. That's crazy. Well, figure it out ahead of time. What kind of mic are you going to use? This is a laser pointer, ladies and gentlemen. It is not a weapon. I need to give weapon training. Right after this, we'll be giving a 5-minute weapon training class with this. But there are people who literally don't know this is an on-off button. And they're nervous. So they start their talk on. And then no matter what they do, it's everywhere they go. And so the entire talk, everybody in this, there are a couple of people here I know from the vision community know that the single thing that your eye is most attracted to in life is something that's moving. So they don't realize that they're trying to talk to you and they're trying to develop eye contact and you're all following the dot. And then there are these people who love to do this. Is that not the most obnoxious thing in the universe? The problem is you all do it. Don't. Because if you're trying to circle this, vision scientists like me will tell you that's all you see is the dot moving around the outside, and you can't tell them afterwards what the thing is you're trying to illustrate. It's a pointer. Point. Turn it off. But then some of these people will not only do this, but I saw one lady at a conference. She was giving this talk and going all, and she was using her hands and whatever. And finally she says, and so you can see this is really important. Right from the audience, everybody hit the deck. Everybody comes back up and says, oh, what happened? I just saved 196 people from being blinded is what happens. The first 2 minutes are the single most difficult 2 minutes of your life giving a talk. There are no 2 minutes I know that are work, well, various kinds of surgery. But in this particular case, when you stand up cold turkey, I don't care how well prepared you are, you're always nervous. So take the stumbling block out of your way. Think about the 2 minutes when you start your talk very carefully. What is it? How do I want to start? What do I want to say? In what order am I going to do it? And for God's sake, let me get off the first slide or second slide into something that I know, so I'm mostly talking about my stuff, and I'm away with having to just confront looking at 190 people that I don't know, right? And if you work carefully on that first 2 minutes, you'll find out that that 2 minutes goes by okay, and actually you'll have something else running because you're trying to figure out if everything's working during that 2 minutes, and you're trying to get people excited about your talk. Now you're into your stuff, everything's all right, you're off and running. And another trick for doing that in the first 2 minutes is to do something I mentioned earlier I would come back to, and here it is, a technique for de-nervousing you when you get stuck with giving talks to large groups, namely anyone other than yourself. Most of us feel. And that is to choose expressive people in the audience. My own students will forgive me for saying this, but students can look like Stonehenge. Literally. Undergraduates don't. You know, I walk into my undergraduate freshman class and the hands are up before I even say anything. They got questions before I start. The graduate students, it's all been beaten out of them somehow. I don't know what it is. I don't remember the physical torture when I was here, but I do remember the torture. So the fact of the matter is, they'll sit there and look at you like this. And you'll say the single most exciting thing you know. And you'll say something funny. Excuse me, Dr. T, is that on the test now? And so you don't want to look at those people. You just literally don't want to look at those people. But if you look at an audience in which you find people with expressive faces, you'll find that on the left-hand side of your audience, when I noticed that when I first came in, there will be somebody who's nodding their head and smiling when they see a good point. You'll find somebody in the center, in the middle, and you'll find somebody on the right-hand side. Now, the cool thing is, you give the talk to those 3 people. During your first 2 minutes, which you know well, because you followed this prescription, you're searching for those 3 people. That's your job in those first 2 minutes. Because then when you look over there, you look at that person. When you look in the middle, you look at that person. You look over here, you look at that person. If those people are giving you the head motion and the smile, you're doing great. Roll. If those people are starting to look like this, say it a different way. You just lost your test particles, right? But you're not talking to the whole seat. Now, the beautiful thing about humanity is every single person in the room has enough ego that if your eyes are scanning over the whole audience, they think you're giving the talk just to them, personally. And so it works. It'll help you, it'll help them, and it actually does help them because you'll actually give a great talk. It's important, people always ask, should you walk around or not? It's okay to walk around a little bit. It's not a good idea to prance back and forth because people can't focus on what you're talking about. So I think it's important to choose a comfortable place to stand, and don't do a rookie mistake, which is put your feet together. I don't know why it is, but some people think it's clever to put your feet together. Maybe it makes them feel more formal or something. But then they start to constrict, and their shoulders go higher and higher, and the blood gets cut off up here, and they start to go around like a Foucault pendulum. And after 4 or 5 minutes, you wonder if they're going to make it through the talk or just keel over. So, you know, just take a comfortable stance that you can actually support for some reasonable amount of time. Use your hands so that people know you're alive. It's important that the speaker look alive. Most audiences will not stay if the speaker looks frozen, it turns out. I already mentioned this. We already talked about the proper use of the title slide. I think it's important to think very carefully about what you start with in a talk. And it's important that people know that statement of the problem or the content of your talk very early on. So at least the first or the second slide should be a system diagram or a problem statement or some visual articulation of what it is that you think you want them to stay in the auditorium and listen to you talk about. Handling questions, I'll leave for your questions. It's interesting trying to figure out handling how to handle questions in an audience, even the difficult ones. I gave you an idea before to anticipate them by trying to think what kinds of questions people would likely ask about this work and either answer them in the talk or tell them that it's future research, but don't leave them as open loops that make it sound like you've never thought about it, because then for sure somebody will put their hand up and ask you. We can talk about that in more detail. And last but not least, I just leave you with the idea that if you aren't enthusiastic about this work you've spent a couple years working on, don't expect anybody else to be enthusiastic about it either. So don't be afraid to show some enthusiasm. You don't need to come across as, you know, just Mr. Meticulous or Mrs. Meticulous. You're just going right down through each point and you're afraid to even break your mouth from or something. It's okay to be a human being in a talk, and people actually appreciate that. They'd actually rather have 20% less content in the talk and a little bit more of a human being presented to them than they would rather have 100% contact. Otherwise, they just go on the web, and they don't need you being there. So I'd be happy to take any of your questions. I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon, and I hope this at least shakes up a few of your ideas about how to put together an outstanding scientific presentation. Thank you. Yes, please.
Do you put your acknowledgments as a second slide and future work as a last slide?
You mean acknowledgments, contracting agencies, et cetera? My rule of thumb is the following: if I'm going to acknowledge support, it's on a line at the very bottom of one of the first few slides, but it's not a big slide that says acknowledgement. Because even the contracting people don't get happy when you do that, unless you're giving a program review, in which case you don't need to acknowledge them because they're all there, right? So I don't put that slide in, ever. I might, maybe sometimes we put logos in. We just had a contract review on Monday for a Department of Defense telemedicine group in the U.S. Army, and we put their logos in the bottom right-hand corner just so they knew that we were acknowledging that this work was done for them, but we never said anything about it. If you're acknowledging colleagues, that's a different thing entirely. I think it's important to acknowledge your colleagues as much as you possibly can. That's my rule of thumb. A lot of people are very parsimonious about joint authorship. I think that's a bad idea. If people participated in a work with you, why not acknowledge them? So I try to make everybody a co-author I possibly can on all of our presentations and papers. That's the starting point. So if it's on the title slide and it's in the program, they feel acknowledged, for sure. If there are other people that we need to acknowledge, or if we want to introduce our research group, if I were giving a colloquium here at Caltech, for example, and about our project, I might introduce my research group to you. I'd probably put that at the end, after future research directions. That also makes people forget about the technical questions they want to ask you. And you can put pictures of the people in your group and just point out who did which part of the work. That's a very nice thing to do. It's always nice to sometimes bleed that into your talk. And if the talk has several obvious sections to it that were done by different people, you can put their picture and just mention them as you're going through talking about the work. Is that what you had in mind? Other questions? Right there.
I was surprised that you said that you put information on your slides in which you're not planning actually to talk about, because I would rather expect that I would be, as a listening to your talk, I would get distracted because you're talking about something completely different, and oh, this is a nice figure, and but why is he not talking about it?
Exactly. The problem is, you're absolutely right, you put your finger on a dualism, you have a challenge. The challenge is, if I only put things up on the slide that I'm going to talk about, I'm forcing you as an audience member to A, listen to me, and to follow point by point everything I'm saying. But most scientists and engineers are pretty bright. They They don't need to hear the whole explanation. They get it the first sentence, and maybe I go on because I want to give some more detail, but maybe they're attracted to something else, and they actually, on the average, feel better that there are other things up there that they can take a peek at to get the whole picture that I don't have time to talk about. And in fact, I have to confess, I'm one of those people. I typically, when somebody puts a new slide up, I typically go through it as quickly as I can, and then I listen to them. And I find that the things they don't talk about, I already got in my visual pass through it, and it complements what they're saying in a nice way so that I understand it better. The second purpose for putting that information up there is, for sure, if it's not there, somebody will ask you that question, and then you won't remember the details.
You can have a backup slide.
Pardon me? You can have a backup slide, but often that means that either you have to screw up the order of your slides by putting in the backup slide where it is, or you get to the thing where somebody says, okay, well, just a minute. That's just a minute.
But usually you're not interrupted during the talk, right? At the
Oh, no,
conference,
you always
you have your 10 minutes
No.
or so, and then
Nice idea, not our plan. That happens all the time, that you get interrupted during a talk. If it's a conference and it's a short 12-minute presentation, usually people wait till the end. But if it's a half hour, an hour presentation, and you hope to be giving them, then you should encourage people to ask questions while you're talking. If you're giving a seminar at a university, definitely people ask questions before you even start. And so I think it's always been much more helpful to me to more or less have the whole story there. Not in complete detail, but they're cues to me. For one audience, I might decide to if somebody may ask a question, I might decide to explain something I wouldn't have otherwise, and it's right there. So for me, it works better to think a little bit more holistically about what a smart person would gather. And then for people that are outside my areas, I'm going to lead them through it so they can follow it too. That's my goal. Thanks for the question.
So that's why you don't reveal your bullets on good time.
I hate that. And that's just a personal preference, maybe. I know some people love to do this, and the worst ones are the ones where it kind of peels across the art of scientific presentation. That drives me crazy when I see it, when I'm in the audience. I feel like you can't trust me to just look at your stuff, because the speaker is actually telling you, I believe so much that you should listen to exactly every word I'm talking about, that I'm not even going to show you what the next thing is until I get there. And that grates on a lot of people. And I hear a lot of negative comments from my faculty colleagues when people do that. I actually co-taught a class with another gentleman who did that, and I had to go through, the next year I taught it by myself, I had to go through and take that out of all the slides. The students would always laugh when one would pop up. But I don't find that to be useful in general. Occasionally I'll do that with a two-part slide. So I'll show you a slide that's got some things on it, but there's one, the big bombshell I want to hold off on. And then I'll show you the same slide again with that piece put in, but not bled one way or the other, just there it is, so that I can make that point exactly when I want to. Does that answer your question? Please.
Do you have any tips about slide design in terms of drawing the eye, it's better to put like a punchline, in a particular place, or whether there's a flow to it?
Oh, absolutely. And those books will really help also. I happen to favor, if I possibly can, a slide that has something visual on it and parsimonious text bullets. Because I find that if it's a technical graph, it's a result, I want to spend some time on the data, but